Titan says, how many Jewish people are on the Canadian Supreme Court? How many judges are there? Who are they, and who put them in power? I think it's a pretty similar situation to the U.S. There are a total of 4 Supreme Court justices who are Jewish: Rosalie Abela, Morris Fish, Bora Laskin. I don't know if they're all serving still, but I think it's pretty much a close to 50% situation. So it's very similar to the US.
What
Like
is the Jewish
everything.
population? Can't It's less than 1%, isn't it?
Oh, absolutely. We're talking about a major overrepresentation.
So you're talking about a 5,000%, right? No, 5,000%, 5,000% overrepresentation, 50 times their percentage of population. Now, it's kind of difficult. They always argue that the reason why they're there is because they're just smarter than everybody else. But when you take 1% of the population, even if they were double smart, maybe they'd be 2%, right? Maybe they'd be one judge if they were lucky, right? But they're 50%. That's crazy. And it's a good example of how that they always do this. In fact, and the interesting thing is, even when they always say this, if they look at the Jewish percentage, for instance, at Harvard or the Ivy League, and it's way out of proportion, and they'll say something like, well, that's because Jews are smarter than everybody else. They work harder. If you said that about white people, you'd say that was the biggest racist in the world to say that, right? So, I mean, the hypocrisy is legend.
Absolutely, there is a form of supremacism there, definitely. Good times that I read. Stefan Crowther says, best chat I've seen in a while. Fernando Covet says, the banks want immigrants to get on more loans. K. Max McDonald says, Dr. David Duke, what happened to the WASP elites like Walt Disney of the 1950s, and what they did not see to help our people stay in power? Were they foolish, or were they just bowled over? What happened to these WASP elites?
Well, that answer is pretty simple. It's hard to just answer that in one sentence. I'd like to explain it a little bit, but I'll try not to stay too long on that subject. But what happened basically is they won in the early part of the 20th century in both Europe, England, Canada, and around the world. All these countries, most of the white world was adopting immigration restrictions. They understood the danger. There were massive numbers of books about this danger. Anthropology was a worldwide science, which in anthropology was called racial science, because the truth is races are real. They're created by evolutionary forces of geographic separation over long periods of time. It's the same principle as the biodiversity of nature. We have that in mankind. So we really won on those issues. We lost because too many people who should have been talking about the tribal takeover of our media. The New York Times was taken over, for instance, in 1895 by Adolph Ochs. Since that time, the world's leading paper, the most quoted paper by thousands of other papers, is the New York Times. It led much of the world to war in the Iraq War. It led us and promoted the First World War, the Second World War, the Iraq War, the Afghanistan War. I can show you Tom Friedman in the New York Times with a big editorial April a year ago that said, Mr. Trump, why are you attacking ISIS? We like ISIS. I mean, ISIS is fighting those old evil Syrians. We all know that those Syrians and Iranians, they're the biggest promoters of terrorism around the world. Right. Sure. What just somebody tell me, one of these Zio talking heads tell me about all the Iranian terrorism, like in Paris that existed last year, or in Tours, or in Coventry in Great Britain, or in the subways of Great Britain, or in Germany at the Christmas market, or in America at the Boston at the marathon, and about the nightclub in San Bernardino. Just tell me about all those Iranian terrorists. But we hear these lies every day, all the time. So the problem was, and this is why I'm saying this and trying to elucidate it a little bit. If we thought that we win the issue on the immigration, we win the issue on race, and that was enough because it was logical, it was factual, it was scientific, it was truly about human rights, to understanding differences of human beings and allowing them to be different, allowing them not to be regimented and controlled by others in the empires that are multicultural of the world, but to allow every people to rule themselves. So we thought we'd won, but all during this time, the small minority, who is the most racial minority in the world, the most racially conscious minority of the world, that had kept their, in effect, even though they're mixed people originally, they have kept and they've really preserved their unique DNA. Every Jew, whether it's Sephardic or Ashkenazi, from Russia to Spain to North Africa, the Mizrahi, the Sephardim, the Ashkenazim, they're all like fourth or fifth cousins. That's the genetic tree. You can check this out through DNA tests. And while they also combine together as a group, they fight for their own interests, which is fine for people to fight for their own interests. It's just kind of awful to have a double standard and fight for your interests while not allowing anybody else to defend their own interest in a country where you're a tiny minority, but you think you have some sort of a right to rule over the media and put out media that degrades and defames and hates the founding elements of that country, who lead the country in terms of their control of politics. They control the financing. We talked about the Supreme Court a minute ago. One of the most terrible decisions of the Supreme Court was to allow people, these big billionaires, these oligarchs of money, can give whatever money they want in politics. That's not democracy. That means we do not have a democracy. The media is lying about that. We have an oligarchy. In fact, we have a zyarchy. We have a zyarchy. And that's what we have today, because the 7 or 8 biggest contributors to Hillary Clinton were all Zionists. They were all Jewish tribalists who support the Jewish state of Israel and Jewish interests line up very clearly. And that's why they hate Trump. We can go into that in a minute, but that's why they hate Trump, because Trump went against their agenda. The reason why that we won for a while in the beginning of the 20th century, but we lost over the decades since then, is because we didn't recognize Jewish racism. We didn't understand their dedication to power over us. And they're long endemic, and this doesn't mean every Jew. And again, I've got to be real careful here, because I'm not saying every Jew hates us or every Jew is a bad person or every Jew is an evil person, but there's no question that the Jewish establishment knows exactly what they're doing. They want to destroy European mankind. It's a long simmering hatred all the way since the Romans conquered them in the Middle East 2,000 years ago. And they took the name for the Romans, which was the name gens, which was the Roman ruling families. And then they called the rest of humanity Gentiles, non-Jews. And Gentile is not used with a lot of favoritism. And what's happening is that they led Bolshevism, dominated Bolshevism, which killed tens of millions of our people, both in Russia, Ukraine, across Europe. They helped sponsor these wars, the First and Second World War, which killed 100 million people combined. And they tried to sponsor these wars for their own interests. They even did a deal with Rothschild to get America into the war, my country into the war, with a promise that they'd get America into the war because of Jewish influence and power in economics and in politics. Bernard Baruch was the big financier who was basically with Woodrow Wilson, who could affect Wilson. Jacob Schiff was one of the biggest Wall Street brokers who not only supported Zionism, he was the biggest single contributor on earth to communism and the rise of communism, which killed tens of millions of people. So what we can learn by this, so the reason we lost wasn't because we didn't address the danger of our institutions being taken over. Even at that time, we wanted to go, or some of our people, they wanted to go to hotels that didn't have Jews. They wanted to go, and limit certain things, but they didn't stand up when it came to taking over our newspapers, taking over our book publishing, taking over our film industry. And the only last thing I'll say, and I'm going to cut myself a little short. Think of it this way. In the 1930s, communism at that moment, and by the way, Jewish-led Bolshevism, and especially Yagoda, They were killing tens of millions of European Christian people. That's what they were doing. There were no movies in Hollywood about this atrocity. The New York Times wasn't headlining this atrocity every day. And anybody that tried to talk about this atrocity, you know what they said? They said, oh, this is ridiculous. They're not doing that. Well, now we know they were doing that. And so it was this takeover that's led us to this situation. And right now, some people in the alt-right or the alt-light maybe, or the conservative movement or the anti-immigration movement are making the same mistake. They think somehow, oh, we're just going to talk about immigration and we're going to solve that problem. No, I promise you, you're not going to solve. They'll figure out a way to do it by hook or crook or law or trick or controlled elections until you overthrow this tyrannical oligarchy, zygarchy, that controls the globalist media, that controls globalist banking, that controls politics in so many ways. You can see the influence in Great Britain. Mark can talk about that. You can see the influence in France, the CRIP. You can see the influence in Canada. You can see the influence of, obviously, in America. You can see it in Argentina. You can see it in Italy. You can see it in the Balkans. It's everywhere. And until that power is overthrown and our people are truly free to have a society and a government and a culture that's our own, and it's interested in the advancement of our own people's interest, until that happens, nothing is going to change. We have to talk about the immigration, but it's even more essential to not only talk about the immigration, but talk about why we have this massive immigration, why we're being taught to hate ourselves in the media.